It was the winter of 1942, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where valleys swallow sound and roads turn to mud after rain. In a farmhouse battered by wind and neglect, a story began that would haunt an entire community for generations. The hour was close to midnight when a local midwife was summoned. She trudged through the biting cold, lantern in hand, boots sinking into the frost-hardened earth. The family waited in silence, their faces pale, their voices hushed. What she encountered inside that cramped wooden home would mark the beginning of one of America's most disturbing hidden legacies. The room was dim, lit only by 2 gas lamps sputtering in the corners. The smell of iron, blood, damp wood, and coal smoke filled the air. She worked quickly, as she had done many times before, but when the baby slid into her hands, her breath caught. The infant's eyelids were smooth, unbroken skin, stretched across where eyes should have been. No sockets beneath. No pupils searching the shadows. Just emptiness, she recoiled. For the first time in her career, the midwife did not announce the child's arrival. No, it's a boy, no, it's a girl. Only silence. The mother turned her face away, tears slipping down her cheeks. The father, rigid and wordless, pressed his lips into a thin line. He refused to meet the midwife's eyes. He simply muttered, "Don't speak of it." Outside, a storm gathered. Wind rattled the loose boards, as if the house itself were shivering. Within days, word began to spread through the valley. Neighbors whispered of curses, of bloodlines that had twisted too tightly upon themselves. Some said this was punishment for sins long buried. Others claimed it was proof of bad blood, a phrase that had followed this family for decades. The child was hidden almost immediately. Curtains drawn, visitors turned away. When curious neighbors came calling, they were met with sharp words, sometimes even threats. What lived inside that farmhouse was not to be seen, not to be spoken of, and yet, secrets have a way of escaping. An elderly neighbor, years later, recalled hearing the child's cries in the night, a strange, hollow sound that seemed to carry further than any ordinary wail. Another remembered a shadow moving behind the upstairs window long after the lamps had been extinguished. But in 1942, none of this could be confirmed. Only whispers, only suspicion. The family closed ranks, retreating deeper into silence. Even the midwife, who had witnessed the birth firsthand, vanished from public view soon after. Some said she moved away. Others claimed she had been persuaded to forget what she saw. Still, one undeniable truth remained. An eyeless child had been born in that farmhouse. And if the rumors were true, this was not the first time. Pause. What curse, what history could give rise to a child born without eyes? The valley would not find answers. Not yet. But in the silence of that farmhouse, a dark legacy was already taking root. To understand the child's birth, we must step back to the land itself, to the farm where generations of bloodlines had tightened like a noose. The house stood on a slope above a hollow, miles from the nearest paved road. In winter, snow buried the path. In summer, weeds reclaimed it. The family was not simply remote, they were cut off. No telephone lines strung across the trees. No radios buzzing with news from the outside world. Only the silence of mountains, broken by the lowing of cattle and the distant echo of coal trains. The barns were rotting, boards warped and sagging. The mines that once promised work now lay hollowed and black, their entrances collapsed and forgotten. The air carried the smell of damp earth, coal dust, and something faintly metallic, like rust that never left the skin. Neighbors described the place as a farm of ghosts. Few dared to visit. Those who did rarely returned twice. For generations, the family had married only their own, cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces. Outsiders were considered intruders, threats to their way of life. Poverty bound them, but pride steered their choices. To them, deformity was no greater shame than the thought of tainting their blood with strangers. Pause. The surname itself carried weight. In courthouse records it appeared again and again, bound to whispers of stillbirths, feeble minds, and children born twisted in ways too disturbing to describe. Clerks noted it quietly, shaking their heads. Locals avoided it entirely when writing marriage contracts. One former county registrar recalled how elders would come to his office, pressing him to keep certain records hidden. "Best not to stir it up," they would mutter. He admitted later, everyone knew about the curse, but no one wanted it written in ink. Among the community, the term was passed in hushed tones, the curse of the bloodline. But inside the farmhouse, no one called it a curse. They called it survival. The family believed their traditions protected them, that outside blood carried worse danger, betrayal, exploitation, shame. Outsiders might laugh, point, or condemn. Better, they thought, to keep their secrets behind nailed doors and shuttered windows. A surviving neighbor described the atmosphere well. You never saw them in church, never saw them at town gatherings, but you heard them, laughing, shouting, singing to themselves in the dark. They didn't need anyone else. Or maybe they just couldn't risk it. Yet isolation breeds silence, and silence breeds decay. The hollow became a world unto itself, time moving slower there than in the rest of America. When war raged overseas, when radios carried speeches of presidents, here there was only the creak of old floorboards and the whisper of kin marrying kin. The child born without eyes was not an accident, nor an isolated tragedy. It was the inevitable harvest of seeds sown long before, and the deeper one digs into that hollow, the clearer the question becomes. Was this family preserving their legacy, or destroying it from within? Long before the eyeless child was born, the family's story was already written in whispers. Oral histories from the valley tell of ancestors who crossed oceans, only to turn inward the moment they reached the mountains. Settlers who carved out land, raised barns, and then married only their own blood. Cousins to cousins, brothers to nieces. Even whispered tales of siblings bound not just by name, but by marriage vows. In a faded leather-bound Bible discovered decades later, the pattern is clear. Handwritten entries, names scratched in ink now brown with age, reveal marriages that never left the bloodline. Page after page, the same surnames repeat, looping back upon themselves like a snake devouring its own tail. Neighbors, those few who dared to speak, remembered the stories their grandparents told around firelight, of prosperity once tied to strange rules. One tale claimed the family's cattle thrived, while surrounding farms starved. Another insisted that their corn never failed, even in drought. The explanation was whispered with unease, that long ago the patriarchs struck a pact, a bargain sealed not with outsiders, but with their own kin. Blood must remain pure, they said, to keep land and fortune strong. But if such a pact was real, its price was steep. With every passing generation, the stories grew darker. Children born without tongues, unable to speak. Infants with ribs collapsed, one lung suffocating the other. Babies who did not cry but instead gasped like animals drowning in air. Most dismissed these tales as superstition, mountain folklore spun to scare children into obedience. And yet, when the eyeless child arrived in the 1940s, the old stories resurfaced with terrifying clarity. One neighbor, an old man named Harland, recalled sitting on his porch as a boy when he overheard his grandfather mutter, "It'll show in their eyes, mark my words. That's where the curse always shows first." Harland laughed it off for years. But when news spread of the baby born with sealed lids, no sockets beneath, the words came rushing back. He admitted decades later, "I didn't believe it then, but I do now." Folklore, once dismissed as backward superstition, began to feel like prophecy. What makes these accounts so unsettling is not their drama, but their consistency. The same themes repeated through time: purity, prosperity, and punishment. Families in rural America often clung to tales of curses to explain misfortune, but here the line between myth and reality blurred too neatly. The eyeless child was not just a tragedy of birth. It was a symbol, proof that the bloodline's silence and secrecy had consequences no one could deny. And so, the valley faced a question that lingered in every hushed conversation, every closed door, every turned-away doctor. Were these merely old mountain legends, or had the family's pact carved itself into flesh, a warning that could no longer be ignored? The year was 1953. A storm pressed low over the Appalachian hills, blackening the sky when a county doctor was summoned to a farmhouse deep within the hollow. He arrived by lantern light, his horse-drawn buggy sliding through mud, the smell of wet earth and rotting wood rising thick in the night. Inside, the cabin walls were dark with smoke. Children crouched in silence, their eyes wide, their bodies thin. He had been called to deliver another child, but what he found shook even his practiced hands. The infant's limbs were twisted, bent at unnatural angles. its chest sunk inward, the shallow rise and fall barely sustaining life. And just as before, its face bore the same haunting mark. Eyelids smooth, sockets absent. The eyeless child was no longer just rumor. It was fact. The doctor, his name barely legible in faded records, Dr. Harlan, or perhaps Harlan, began to write. He documented the deformities, noting malformations of the spine, the slowed reflexes of older siblings, the absence of speech in children well past toddler years. His notes carried a chilling phrase underlined twice, degeneration consistent with consanguinity, but science was not welcome here. When he attempted to return days later for follow-up, he was met not with gratitude but with guns. A cousin stood on the porch, a shotgun leveled at his chest. "Keep out of our blood," the man growled, his voice steady, his eyes cold. The doctor, realizing the threat was not idle, retreated. Still, he tried to act. He filed his notes with the county clerk. Yet the pages never saw daylight. Witnesses claimed they were pulled from the files by a relative who worked in the courthouse. Others whisper that the sheriff himself, tied by blood to the family, ensured the documents were destroyed. For a brief moment, fragments of the doctor's warnings survived. A nurse who assisted him recalled the strange way he trembled after leaving the cabin, whispering, "It's not just birth defects. It's a pattern, a curse written in flesh." But even she vanished from the record soon after, and then so did the doctor. By the late 1950s, his name disappeared from county rosters. His practice closed. No obituary, no forwarding address, just absence, like he had been scrubbed from history. Those who remembered him claimed he left out of fear, but others suggest a darker end, that the same bloodline he tried to expose ensured his silence. The investigation that might have changed everything instead dissolved into shadows. No charges, no headlines, just a family retreating further into secrecy, armed with both guns and silence. And so the question lingers, unanswered, unsettling. Did the doctor leave to save himself? Or did the bloodline erase him, the way it erased so many who dared to look too closely? The child without eyes grew, but his silence was more haunting than any cry. He never spoke, never formed words, never looked upon the world. Yet at night, the valley carried sounds that no one could quite explain. A muffled wail, sometimes drawn out into a howl, sometimes cut short as if smothered. Locals swore they could hear it echoing off the ridges, slipping into their homes like a draft they could not block. By the 1950s, the house where he lived had become an object of quiet terror. Its windows were boarded shut from the inside. Curtains, heavy and yellowed, sagged in the few panes left uncovered. To outsiders, it looked abandoned, a collapsing farmhouse left to rot. But neighbors knew better. Smoke still rose from its chimney in the winter. Chickens scratched in the dirt yard. And sometimes, when the wind shifted, you could hear shuffling steps across the warped wooden porch. Those who dared approach told chilling stories. A traveling salesman claimed he saw a shadow dart across an upstairs window, impossibly tall, thin, and awkward in its movements. A county health worker, sent to check on the family in the late 1960s, described a foul odor, a mix of rot and mildew, pouring from the cracks in the walls. She left before knocking on the door, and she never returned. The younger generations of the family began to drift away around this time. Some moved to nearby towns, where they tried to live quiet, anonymous lives. But even there, whispers followed them. People asked about their last names, their strange mannerisms, their refusal to speak of the old farm. They carried their shame like an inheritance, always unspoken, yet always present. Those who stayed behind grew harder, colder, more secretive. The homestead turned inward, fortified by superstition and fear. Visitors were warned off with rifles pointed from the shadows of the porch. Strangers who asked too many questions about the boy, now a man, though still locked in the silence of childhood, were told, "Best leave old mountain ways alone." In these hills, silence became a tradition, a kind of binding oath. Fathers taught sons never to speak of what they saw. Mothers whispered warnings to daughters. Some truths don't belong to outsiders. The legacy of the bloodline was not just the deformities that it produced, but the silence that surrounded them. A silence passed down like property, like land, like a curse, and yet the silence was never complete. Rumors spilled into the nearby towns. Children dared one another to sneak toward the property at night. Old men drinking in taverns muttered about the eyeless one who lived on. Long after he should have died, the question lingered in every whisper. Was the man still alive in that boarded house decades later? Or had something else taken his place? Something that explained the shadows moving across windows that should have been nailed shut. The silence protected the family. But it also fed the fear. The discovery came almost by accident. In the summer of 1982, a small investigative team, part local historians, part amateur genealogists, pushed their way through a thicket of vines and brambles behind the collapsing family homestead. What they expected was nothing more than a trash heap, maybe an old well. What they found instead froze them where they stood. The outlines of weathered wooden crosses, half swallowed by moss, leaning in every direction like broken teeth. It wasn't a cemetery in the traditional sense. There were no polished stones, no iron gates. The ground was uneven, sinking in places as if the earth itself sagged under hidden weight. Most markers were crude, nothing more than planks hammered together, carved with rough initials. JH, MR, CW. A few bore only a single letter. Some had no markings at all. The deeper they searched, the darker the revelations became. Several of the graves were shockingly small, no larger than the length of a cradle. Investigators realized they were standing in a burial field for infants, babies who had lived mere days, perhaps hours. Other graves were grouped close together, siblings interred side by side. The sheer number raised a question none of them wanted to voice. How many children had been born into this bloodline, only to vanish without record, without ceremony, without acknowledgement? Forensic specialists were later called to the site. What they unearthed confirmed the darkest suspicions. Skeletal remains told a story that words could not. Tiny bones bent at impossible angles, skulls misshapen, stretched or compressed in ways that defied natural order. Evidence of congenital deformities repeated across generations, hidden in the soil as carefully as they had been hidden in life. And then came the discovery that shook even the most seasoned examiner. Among the remains was a child-sized skeleton with no eye sockets at all. Smooth bone stretched across where cavities should have been, as if the very possibility of sight had been erased at birth. For the investigators, it was proof that the infamous eyeless child was not an isolated horror. It was a legacy, a recurring outcome of the bloodline's secrecy and isolation. Local reactions were swift and uneasy. Neighbors who had once dismissed rumors as folklore now spoke in hushed tones. Some admitted they had always suspected the family buried their dead on the property, but none imagined it on this scale. Others refused to acknowledge the graveyard at all, insisting it was best left undisturbed, and that those children belonged to the mountain. The investigators documented everything, photographs and field notes sealed away in county records. But even in the sterile language of reports, the horror bled through. Each grave marker was not just a memorial, but a testimony, a record of how many lives were conceived, malformed, and quietly extinguished under the weight of secrecy. And yet, the most chilling question remained unanswered. If so many graves were hidden behind the farmhouse, how many more might lie scattered across the hills, unmarked and forgotten? By the 1990s, the silence that had shrouded the valley for generations began to crack. The old family home had fallen deeper into decay, its boarded windows staring blankly across the fields. Younger residents left the mountain for good, leaving behind only stories. And in the absence of the family's iron grip, former neighbors began to speak. One woman, now in her 70s, recalled the first and only time she was invited into the farmhouse as a girl. "I thought I heard a baby crying," she told interviewers decades later. "When I looked into the parlor, I don't know what I saw. Something sitting in a rocking chair, no eyes, just a smooth face turned toward me." Her voice trembled as she described the sound, and a low, guttural moan that still haunted her dreams. Another testimony came from a man who had lived on the ridge opposite the homestead. He described summer nights when the cries of a child would roll across the valley, sharp enough to cut through the stillness of crickets and frogs. It wasn't like a normal cry, he said. It was ragged, like it hurt just to breathe. Then suddenly it would stop. Dead quiet. You'd lie awake wondering if the child was still alive. His wife added that she would sometimes see shadows moving in the upper windows of the farmhouse. Long after midnight, perhaps the most chilling account surfaced from an aging farmer who had spent his entire life in those hills. Over black coffee at his kitchen table, he confessed he once stumbled on a sight he could never forget. "They left it in the woods," he muttered. "A baby, deformed, still moving but weak. I didn't touch it. I didn't dare. By the time I told anyone, it was gone." His words were met with disbelief at first, but the weight in his eyes betrayed no sign of invention. These testimonies were scattered, fragmented, and often delivered with hesitation. Some neighbors spoke only after swearing anonymity, fearful that even decades later, the family's shadow might reach them. Others contradicted each other on details, but together their voices formed a pattern too disturbing to dismiss. They spoke of secrecy, of unnatural births, of cries in the night cut short by sudden silence. Investigators who gathered these accounts noted an eerie consistency. None of the witnesses ever saw the children in daylight. Every sighting, every sound, came cloaked in darkness, behind boarded windows from deep in the valley woods, or through the cracked door of a parlor where no guest was welcome. By the time these recollections surfaced, most of the direct family members were gone, their bloodlines scattered or dead. But the neighbors' stories resurrected what the family had tried so hard to bury. This was not the tragedy of a single child, but a legacy that stretched across multiple generations. And as these voices emerged from decades of silence, one unsettling truth became clear. The mountain had not forgotten, and neither had the dead. By the late 20th century, whispers and testimonies gave way to analysis. For the first time, outsiders with scientific training looked beyond rumor and folklore, asking not only what happened but why. Geneticists, combing through what fragments of evidence remained, burial records, coroner's notes, and the testimonies of neighbors, began to piece together a grim but logical pattern. The family's refusal to marry beyond their bloodline had sealed their fate. Cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, generation after generation. What folklore had described as a curse was, in truth, the cold arithmetic of genetics. Anophthalmia, the complete absence of eyes, appeared in medical texts as a rare but documented condition. Cognitive delays, malformed bones, shortened limbs, each could be explained as the amplified consequences of recessive genes colliding again and again within the same closed bloodline. The discoveries stripped away the veil of superstition, yet what they revealed was no less horrifying. A geneticist interviewed in 1993 described it plainly. This was preventable. These weren't random tragedies. This was the direct result of choices made, knowingly or not, to preserve isolation over survival. His words echoed like a verdict, delivered decades after the fact, but in the valley itself, the scientific explanations did little to soften the unease. To those who lived through it, the image of a child with no eyes was not a case study in recessive inheritance. It was a living embodiment of folklore's warnings. Old stories of pacts and blood purity, of prosperity tied to sacrifice, suddenly seemed less like superstition and more like premonition. Science had not erased folklore. It had translated it. For the families who left the mountains, these revelations brought no comfort. One woman, whose grandmother had married into the bloodline before fleeing the valley, spoke with quiet bitterness. They could have stopped. They could have chosen differently. But they didn't. They knew something was wrong and kept doing it anyway. Records showed that midwives in the region had begged mothers to seek help in distant towns, to break the cycle, to leave behind the secrecy. But time and again the family chose silence. Pride, shame, and fear outweighed salvation. And so, child after child, generation after generation, the same legacy repeated itself. The clash of science and folklore revealed something darker than either alone. Folklore had tried to warn, keep the blood pure and a price will be paid. Science explained the mechanism. Inbreeding exposes what nature meant to stay hidden. But together they told a story not of inevitability, but of willful neglect. The revelation left investigators with a haunting truth. These horrors were not just born of isolation, but of choice. Every grave, every scream in the night, every eyeless child was the product of a decision carried out across generations. And yet, as science pulled the curtain back, one final question lingered in the air. If the family knew the price of secrecy, why did they continue to pay it? The story seemed destined to fade into memory. But in the early 2000s, whispers surfaced once more. whispers of a child born in the same valley, carrying the same chilling legacy. The mother was barely 16. Hospital staff in a nearby county recalled her arrival, pale, trembling, escorted by two older men who refused to give their names. The delivery room was silent but tense, the only sounds the rattling of an ancient air vent and the nervous clearing of throats. And then the midwife gasped. The baby entered the world without eyes. Its skin was pallid, the sockets sealed smooth as wax. For the nurses, it was as though the past had clawed its way back into the present. "It was like something we shouldn't have seen," one nurse later whispered. "Like the kind of thing people try to forget." Before paperwork could be filed, the child was taken. Witnesses remembered the family gathering around the newborn, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Within hours, the baby vanished from the hospital records entirely. No birth certificate, no autopsy, nothing. Rumors spread that the infant was carried back to the old homestead and buried in the same hidden graveyard where dozens of others lay. Investigators who returned to the overgrown cemetery years later reported fresh earth near the edge, unmarked as though someone had hurriedly concealed a body. No one dared confirm it. For those who lived in the valley, the event felt like a final chapter being written in blood. By then, the family line had thinned almost to extinction. Some had scattered into neighboring towns, changing their surnames, marrying outside to dilute the stain. Others remained, but in silence, shunning outsiders more fiercely than ever. The last eyeless child became less a person and more a symbol, the culmination of centuries of secrecy, pride, and silence. It was a grotesque echo of all the whispered stories that came before. The baby rocking in the farmhouse, the graveyard filled with children, the cries that haunted the valley at night. Local officials looked the other way, as they always had. To investigate meant stirring up a history that no one wanted on the record. Better to let it sink beneath the soil unmarked, as it always had been. But those who remembered could not escape the feeling that the birth was more than coincidence. It was a warning, a final manifestation of what happens when a bloodline becomes a prison, a haunting end to a story that had stretched across generations. The valley itself seemed to absorb the memory. Hollowed-out barns stood like tombstones. Windows boarded shut stared blankly into the hills. And in the silence, one question remained, more chilling than the discovery itself. If the last eyeless child has already been buried, does the legacy end there, or does it still live on, hidden behind new names waiting to resurface again? The story of the eyeless child does not end in the graveyard. It lingers, not just in the valley but in the imagination of anyone who dares to confront it. What began as whispers about one family expands into a mirror of America's darker truths. The dangers of silence, the weight of secrecy, and the slow violence of generational isolation. The farmhouse is gone now, its beams collapsing under ivy and rot. Yet those who pass along the dirt road still lower their voices when they point toward the hollow. "That's where it happened," they murmur, careful not to say too much. For them, the ruins are not just remnants of wood and stone. They are evidence of choices that bred tragedy into the soil itself. Anthropologists describe the family's history as a cautionary tale, how closed bloodlines, born from geography and poverty, can spiral into unthinkable deformities. Psychologists frame it as generational trauma, each birth defect a physical reminder of wounds carried forward in silence. But these scientific terms do little to ease the unease. The horror is not in the explanation. It is in the image. Children born without eyes, their lives extinguished before they could even speak. Neighbors who lived through it still wrestle with guilt. One woman, now in her 80s, confessed to a journalist that she once heard an infant wailing from the woods. "I thought it was a fox at first," she said, her voice cracking. "Then I realized it was a baby, and then it stopped." Her words hang heavy, a reminder of how silence was enforced not just by the family, but by the community itself. For generations, pride disguised itself as protection. Outsiders were labeled threats, their questions unwelcome. Yet in guarding their bloodline, the family ensured its collapse. The legacy of the eyeless children is proof that silence can destroy more thoroughly than exposure ever could. And so the valley remains haunted, not by ghosts in the traditional sense, but by memory. Every decayed barn, every sunken grave, every boarded window tells a story without words. A story of what happens when truth is buried too deep, and when loyalty to blood outweighs loyalty to life. The eyeless child, the figure that began as a single, unthinkable birth, becomes something larger. A symbol not only of one family's tragedy, but of the hidden costs embedded in America's forgotten corners. It is a warning carved into the landscape that history's darkest stories are never just legends. They are lived, passed down in whispers, and, if left unspoken, destined to repeat. As the narrator's voice fades, one question remains. Suspended like fog in the hollow, how many other valleys, tucked away in the mountains or along back roads, hold secrets just as disturbing, waiting for the day someone dares to uncover them?